You've just come out with the book, The Outrage Machine: How Tech Amplifies Discontent, Disrupts Democracy, and What We Can Do About It. I think that anybody who is alive right now who has a pulse can guess why you wrote this book. But if you could you walk us through the origin story as it relates to your particular interest in the subject and kind of how that interest became this piece of work?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So I had a really strange experience going viral when I was rather young, in an age a bit before social media. This is kind of a bizarre origin story, but basically I was traveling through Asia when I was 23 years old, just doing a backpacking trip and some volunteer work. And while I was there, I met this monk who basically invited me out to his village in the middle of nowhere. I was in Cambodia at the time. And he brought me out to the village kind of under the premise of a community visit to meet his relatives, have a nice day in the countryside. And when I got out into his village, he kind of jumped me with this project. He sat me on this pagoda, and there was several hundred villagers there, common council of village elders. And they all kind of stood up one by one and said, "Thank you for coming. We have this problem. Our reservoir, it broke. Thank you for agreeing to help us build it, help rebuild it." And so I was, needless to say, surprised and definitely, kind of shocked at both the expectation that I would potentially do that, as well as the assumption that I could even do something like that. I was a backpacker. I had very little money even to finish my backpacking trip at the time. But what I did have was the internet, and so this community of it was about 6,000 people. They were rice farmers primarily, and they were looking for help in rebuilding this pretty massive irrigation structure that had been destroyed during the Civil War there in the mid-'70s. And they used it ostensibly for a second crop of rice annually, which is the difference between, poverty and surplus for them. I mean, it's all pretty relative. They're all very poor, and a second crop of rice isn't going to lift them out of poverty, but it was the difference between subsistence and having a little bit of extra income. And so it was a very worthy cause in this community. I was 23 years old. I had no engineering background. I had, no trust fund or anything. But what I did was I wrote an email to some friends, and just kind of in the form of a missive, a travel missive, saying, "I had this crazy experience. I met these monks. They were looking for help in doing this thing. This is a wild thing. This is a wild project. I think it could use help." And that email went to a kind of standard email list of friends and family, and then it also went to this listserv that was plugged in to a site that a couple of friends had built. And that site had profile pictures. It was a site kind of dedicated to my extended friends of friends of friends in California. Had profile pictures, a feed. It was basically a social media site before social media existed, before we had a name for that thing. And so that email went weirdly viral, and suddenly, from point to point to point, I had many strangers reaching out to me to help these monks in the middle of nowhere rebuild this irrigation system. So there was this tremendous wealth. Wealth of access to help that was suddenly available. So that experience, I suddenly had this capacity to support these monks. That changed the trajectory of my life. I was told, I thought it would maybe take a couple of months. They were looking for $15,000 to rebuild this reservoir. I thought it would maybe take a couple of months to do it. I ended up living in Cambodia for almost 7 years, rebuilding this reservoir. We raised over $250,000 for this project, $1 million for the community overall. And it was just this, crazy chapter of my life that was the result of the internet. The internet enabled this, this incredible kind of compassionate outcome for this community living at the edge of nowhere. And so so a couple of those friends went on to start tech companies. One of them ended up being one of the first engineers at Twitter. But I really was sitting with this kind of concept of virality. I've been sitting with it for a very long time. Like, what does virality do to us as a species? What happens when we all have the capacity to go viral for one cause or another? And initially, I thought that was inherently a good thing, like naturally just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I think you probably, I think we're all familiar. We all remember if we think back far enough at how optimistic, the early 2010s were, the Arab Spring and the ability to topple dictators with a tweet, so to speak, or a tweet storm, and this kind of euphoria around these early tools. So I was quite optimistic during that era. But it was also very early to kind of sit with the repercussions of that and the problems associated with that too. Yes, that was the kind of like the initial gestation point for it. But since then, I've become, of course, much more aware of the deep negative components associated with it.
So what do you think turned the tide then? I know you talk about how at one point there's a collection of features that came into play, and you have a nice, beautiful story there about people coming together to help. But that's not really what people think of right now when they think of social media. And it's definitely not what you would think would be part of a book called The Outrage Machine. So what was it that kind of caused that transition to occur in your mind, in society, in the book?
Yeah. So after Cambodia, I moved back to the Bay Area where I grew up, and I ended up hooking up with a whole bunch of really early social media people. So people that were, like I said, the first employees at Twitter. I've also known one of the earliest employees at Facebook for a very, very long time since that era. And there was this ethos of kind of like more compassion is good for the world, more social media equals more compassion, more empathy, more capacity to connect with other people. So a bunch of filmmakers as well. You may remember a strange film called Coney 2012 that was the most viral piece of content in history at that point in time, which was basically a plea to help bring a war criminal to justice in Uganda. This cohort of people that I connected with, that I felt very connected with and very supportive of, were at the advancing edge of being able to kind of create viral cascades of emotion around particular causes we cared about. And, if what happened in Cambodia was this kind of like tiny atomization of that, in the years afterwards, many of these people began to, myself included, began to help get viral causes out there to the world more broadly, right? So, so bringing war criminal to justice, advancing some like UN sustainability goals, trying to get people access to basic surgery, all stuff that like sounds pretty good when you put it into, you're like, oh no, people need help, right? People need help, and they can find help on the internet. That's a great thing. But there's something that's strange that happens when you can kind of open up the control box of our emotions. You can see the button for empathy, which is the one that we're trying to push regularly, right? To get people to care about causes, which I think successfully did quite a bit. You can also, like the button next to the button for empathy is actually the button for outrage. Like outrage and empathy are almost the same. They're very, very, very closely related emotions. So oftentimes if you can make people care about a cause or a person deeply, it's just one step away from getting them to exist on this kind of spectrum of oppressed oppressor, right? Of like who is responsible for their plight, and you can pretty easily point people's fingers towards someone or something that's responsible. Usually, someone that's responsible for the issues that they're facing. And so if you can open the control box for empathy, you can definitely push the buttons for outrage. And I was able to see that beginning to happen. 2012, 2013 in a pretty substantial way that I felt was already a little bit dangerous. And that was just before kind of the rest of the internet woke up to this ability to create these cascades of kind of viral outrage about anything. And particularly media in general, which is, we think about traditional media as being a system for helping us inform, helping us become informed about the world. traditional media, like traditional news organizations, began to lose the battle for our attention. Most people's eyeballs were going to social media. And in order to try to stay relevant, a lot of these journalists and editors at old guard newspapers began to try to refocus their editorial efforts on stories that would actually get viral traction. And that stuff tends to be things that make us angry, upset, and outraged.
So what do you think was the impact of some key design features, right? I'm thinking of a few things in particular. I know you, Gene Twenge, Jonathan Haidt have pointed to things like the share, the retweet, the follow, the like button. These things kind of, I think Haidt calls it the dart gun, right? In one of his recent articles that we can use to shoot each other with, right? To trigger this outrage and empathy. But there's also things like the fact that when you share a piece of content, mostly you're just sharing the title, right? The thing that you get a picture, right, and then you get the title, and then you get a society of people who mostly just read the title, right? So you can obfuscate truth by having a catchy and probably outrage-inducing title, right? And that's what most people see. So maybe you could just kind of talk about how you think these kind of features, these design implementations, maybe led us to this point that we're at now.
Sure. Yeah. So I look at it, and we did a decent amount of research on this, myself and Jonathan Haidt, in advance. We did an article in 2019 called "The Dark Psychology of Social Networks," in which we focused on basically 3 features that were rolled out between 2009 and 2012 that I think mark the turning point in how our attention shifted online. Those features are number one, the algorithmic feed. So rank ordering content based on engagement rather than just reverse chronological, which is, I think we're all aware that that we're not seeing content in reverse chronological order anymore. But that was a pretty big feature transition for the way that we organize content that we're fed in our timelines. And of course, we can have the AI conversation in a little bit and how that relates to how powerful AI has become in kind of rank ordering our attention and keeping us connected to these feeds. The social metrics, so having visible metrics attached to content that actually creates a very strange incentive structure that begins to make us focus on content that makes us our own kind of optimizing machines. Like we're trying constantly to get the stuff that gets the most likes and shares because it is publicly visible. And I think there's like some deeply toxic, problematic components to that when we're looking at we're looking at exactly what our audience wants as opposed to what we might want to say, right? We're in this strange kind of dance with our audience in that process when we're trying to appeal what will get the most likes, shares, comments, etc. And particularly when those things are actually visible, publicly visible. So that's a big piece of it. And then the third one is the one-click share. So having the ability to easily, quickly, in one instant send a piece of content out to everyone. And that's very much related to virality, net virality, but more than anything, it's velocity, right? Which is different. It's the speed at which content spreads. I'm definitely not anti-virality. I think virality is actually a really critical and important power that we have now. But certain content spreads faster than other content these days, and so there's big correlations between negative, sensitive, problematic content and the speed at which that content is shared. So having the instant capacity to share out to your entire audience online has caused a whole range of really fundamental problems with mis and disinformation, for one, which I think is like probably one of the more toxic undercurrents in our society above a certain threshold. So that's, and also emotional content tends to spread much faster than non-emotional content. So so there's some real problems in this. So those are the 3 main areas of transitions, of feature transitions, that I think really did usher us into what I call the viral era, what John calls the post Babel era. And so strange world we're living in now.
Yeah, you mentioned something there that I feel like is pretty interesting. I think I remember there is some studies that showed that people who are insecure about their group membership will be more hostile towards people who are part of the out group, right? So if you're concerned that, let's say I'm a liberal and I don't think I'm liberal enough, I'm worried about whether people like me, I will be more hostile towards people who are conservatives. And you alluded to something interesting there, which is that there's this audience capture that kind of takes place where people begin to become something they're not because that's what the audience wants. Do you think part of what is maybe taking place in this outrage machine is this attempt to look good for people in your in-group because you know that you're not really holding those beliefs, but you feel like you have to in order to have that social validation? And so you are more willing to be outraged at other people to kind of prove your membership?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the research on identity and the psychology of identity, it plays hugely into our social media usage and abuse. There's a fantastic book by Jay Van Bavel at NYU. He has a co-author as well, Dominic. I'm forgetting his last name right now, but fantastic book called The Power of Us, which goes into specifically how the lens of identity influences so much of how we see the world. And on social media, that is the kind of fundamental undercurrent of our groups, because social media is basically this, depending on the platform you're using, right? So like Twitter, for instance, is this giant room that we're walking into, and in this room, it's like a dark, dimly lit space, and we hear people shouting and talking all the time, but we don't know who our people are, right? And that's one of our core desires, is to try to figure out who, where our tribe is, where can I feel safe? Because safety is something that is kind of constantly being tested on social media. And so what people do when they don't know if they're safe is they start looking for people that they can identify with, right? So you'll see a lot of a lot of identifiers on social media. This is one of the reasons I think identity has become such a big thing on social media, is because we don't feel safe in that space, and we're exposed to a lot of threats, like a lot of kind of visible threats, right? A lot of anecdotes about this person. This person was shot. This person was they had a threat against them. This person was terrorized. This person was bullied. And so there's this, we're seeking the protection of our in-group in these spaces in a very significant way. And so one of the ways to do that is to basically be very vocal about what we believe, because we're insecure about our position and our position within this broader space. Plastering an identity on your social media profile, I think, is one really easy way to try to find an in-group in a big, dark, dimly lit space that we can't easily navigate.
Yeah. How do you think that the artificial intelligence and the algorithms then do kind of exacerbate this issue, these us versus them dynamics, or outrage in general? You mentioned just a moment ago that AI is a big part of this. What do you see it doing at present, and where do you see it going in the future? Because obviously right now everyone is concerned with how large language models and machine learning are going to kind of transform our paradigms. And if we're just empowering what's already there right now, I'm concerned it's probably not going to go in a great direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to get to kind of distill down to specific feature sets, and that I think that's helpful in navigating some of the ambiguity about because it feels overwhelming, right, when we're faced with all of these crazy outcomes in aggregate. So so when we're talking about feed sorting, for instance, right, or just general recommendation algorithms, which become much more powerful based on the quantities of data we have, and based on these large language models that have come online in just recent years, we now have the capacity to do just incredible sorting and incredible selection of people, to find interests that people have that they maybe didn't even know they had in the first place, right? So I refer this in the book as the digital shadow self, which is basically, and this happened to me on Quora pretty early. I don't know if you use Quora, the question and answer service,
just a bit.
But they have a pretty sophisticated ML algorithm that they run to keep you coming back to the site. And at least they used to. I'm not sure if they've. I had to unsubscribe because it was so good at pulling me back. And what it would do was it would take the questions that I would normally browse, and I was logged in. So it would capture that information, and then it would find other questions that it thinks that I would be interested in, and it would email me those questions, which seems like a great service. Like, yeah, sure, like fulfilling curiosity and stuff, giving me more of what I want, et cetera, et cetera. But the stuff that I would get and then also click on was something I would never in a million years would I have explicitly spoken about this thing being like something that was of interest to me or something I wanted to learn more about, right? So I got like deep into these rabbit holes on obsolete military hardware from like World War One, and I'm like, why is this interesting to me? I'm like, the A-10 Warthog is still in service, and like what year was that built, and like what's the bore size on this particular like weird stuff like that I literally never would have explicitly stated as one of my interests. It found that interest in me, and it began to kind of pull it out of me. So there is this I think kind of creepy, strange undercurrent, and that's been covered pretty substantially by Center for Humane Technology and Social Dilemma, and kind of that broader polemic about targeting and that we're not really in control of these things and stuff, which I think is an important kind of angle to take to help people wake up to the challenges we're facing here. But there is something kind of more key that's happening, which is these algorithms are discovering parts of ourselves that we didn't necessarily know existed in the first place. And TikTok, wow, I mean, just take a second and talk about that. TikTok is one of these incredible tools for that purpose, right? Yeah. It's just so powerful and so good at identifying things that maybe you didn't even know you wanted to watch in the first place. Which raises some interesting questions about human agency in general as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you think that these algorithms that are leading us to something we didn't know we even wanted are taking us towards positive aspects of self that we didn't know we had within us, or negative aspects? That there's the idea of the race to the bottom of the brainstem kind of thing, and obviously outrage is something that is, I wouldn't say provoking the better aspects of ourselves,
the best
right?
Parts of ourselves, yeah.
Right. But outrage is a great way to keep your attention. It's a great way to keep you engaged, and if you're on an advertising model, then that's a great thing to do. So do you think there is more push to get people to be outraged, or is there something happening there that is just a part of human nature? You know what I mean? Is it just the fact that we do pay attention to outrage more because that's what we do? Or do you think the algorithms do have something in them that are pushing us in that direction because it's a good business model?
Yeah, I mean, yes to both. Absolutely, yes to both. Yeah, the algorithms have found a particular bias in us, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if I like to think about it in terms of the algorithm's eye view of us, right? Which is like, they look at our brains and they see a certain set of behaviors and certain things that they do will up level our attention and suck our attention in, and certain things they do will not. And I think you can look at most of our problems today through the lens of evolutionary psychology, and look at the things that were historically really important for us to pay attention to, right? So gossip and status, for instance, right? These are two really core important elements of our Paleolithic societies, right? It's like, you want to know who has status, who you can trust, and who's doing what in the community that is worthwhile. Like, where do you stand in the eyes of your tribe? And I mean, it makes sense. It makes very clear sense to me why something like social media would capture so much of our attention, because we are obsessed with each other as a species, right? We are deeply obsessed with where we are in relationship to other people, what other people are doing. So that's a core piece of it. Yeah. And these tools have just kind of turned up the what are threats to our safety, right? What are both social threats to our safety, and what are kind of critical physical threats to our safety, both as individuals and as a tribe. That's the kind of stuff that the algorithms have figured out. And like, to qualify, this isn't new. as a principle, I think what's really important to think about here and like to reflect on, and I go into this in the second half of my book, which is these elements of attention capture and extraction have been a core part of the news gathering industry and business for a very long time. Right, it bleeds, it leads. Right, the desire to enrage people and get them to sell or get them to buy papers because they're pissed off about something. Right, these are all elements that in principle I think are very, very much a part of media in general, and particularly like tabloid news has been doing this stuff for a very, very, very long time. It's just that we've gotten much, much better at it, and we've built systems that are much more precise at the process of extracting our attention and selling it against ads.
Right. I recently talked to Nita Farahani, who is based out of Duke, and her big fight right now is cognitive freedom, basically, right? Getting kind of to the point that you alluded to earlier, right? Which is agency, how agency plays into this. Even if this is a reoccurring phenomena that is rooted in the media consumer relationship through time, do you think that there is something that makes this time period or this manifestation especially pernicious because it does have this way to kind of grab somebody's consciousness, to kind of strip them of their cognitive freedom a little bit, because it does have this algorithmically curated model of them that it can use to kind of poke and prod and figure out, what they want, as you alluded to. And it knows quite sophisticated ways to grab you in that way.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really great question, I think, both philosophically as well as the ethically and also technically. Like what is me? What are my preferences? What do I want in the world, right? And I think if you ask most people what they want when it comes to the stuff that's in their feed, they're gonna say, I don't know. I want what is fed to me, right? I want to turn on the TV and just like have exactly what's going to entertain me on there, right? The question of agency, I think, is a really fundamental one to this conversation we're having. I don't believe that we are, that we're just mechanistic creatures with no free will, insofar as like we don't have choices. I do think that per like Sam Harris's argument that we don't actually have free will. I think that there's degrees of free will that we have. I certainly feel more prone to scrolling and getting sucked into these algorithmic rabbit holes when I am at a low agency point in my day, right? When I'm tired, when I'm underfed, when I'm underslept. These are the times in which I think that it's easiest for these little kind of face hugging algorithms to pull us in and keep us there for long periods of time. And I feel better, and I think I read about this a little bit in the book, but there's one particular emotion that I think is very helpful in something that we can look for as individuals when we're engaging with these tools, which is the emotion of regret, which I think is a pretty powerful emotion when it comes to taking an assessment of what we are doing with our time, looking back and figuring out what we should do moving forward. And a lot of the time, regret is a pretty active emotion after the usage of these tools, right? So looking for regret, like I regret spending 6 hours on scrolling social media, right? I almost universally regret that, right? In the moment, you could have asked me at any one of those moments to be like, no, it's fine. I'm okay. Like, it's cool. No, it's the next one, right? But in aggregate afterwards, it's a very much a deeper process in that process of reflection to identify what I did wrong during the entirety of that time. So I like to put this into these buckets that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky came up with, which was the System 1, System 2 dual process model. The book Thinking Fast and Slow, which is this fantastic book about how we have these two fundamental systems in our brains. That the System 1, which is this extremely quick, heuristic-oriented, kind of emotional, instantaneous thinking, which we do most of the time because it's just the automatic processes we're running to live our lives. And then there's system 2, which is the more reflective, analytical parts of our brain that we use to. It's very expensive to use, but it's very important to for wayfinding, for problem solving, for strategy and analysis. And the internet in its current form, specifically social media, is built for system 1, right? It's entirely built for system 1. It's built for fast thinking. It's built for fast responses. It's like we've built an entire machine that is just kind of predating on system 1, right? And so we have these moments with system 2, like afterwards when we're off, right? Or like right when you wake up after a long night of sleep and you just feel like you have this, kind of clear head about you. You're like, like I can do things with my time. I can, the world is my oyster. We have these moments in which I think we have high levels of agency in which we can look at the landscape of our of how we use our attention, and we can analyze it well and say, look, I'm in a high agency state. This is not something I should be doing. I should be putting limits on the time that I'm spending on these tools. I should get some of these apps and tools that can mitigate the amount of time I spend on these tools. And I should reduce my news consumption, that kind of thing, right? Like there are degrees of agency I think we can express in this process, and I do think that helping to identify the types of content and the types of features on these platforms that do prey on kind of system 1 impulsivity is important for fixing them.
Let's jump into that a little bit. How do you feel about the policies and the legislation around these practices? Is this something that you put at the hands of businesses to address? Is this something that you think government has to step in? Is it more about the cultural zeitgeist becoming more mature and learning how to deal with these things themselves? What is the approach that you see as like one of the more viable ones to start to basically protect system 1, right? To kind of say, hey, we maybe shouldn't have an entire industry based on preying on human beings when they're at their most like vulnerable, weakest state. Like that's probably not something we should promote. But how do we then stop that?
Yeah, so I think you can bucket this into 3 broad categories. There's stuff that we can do as individuals. There's stuff that these companies can do, and there's things that governments can do. Of the net leverage points and kind of likelihood to succeed and or be implemented, I think that the second bucket, which is what platforms can do, is the biggest. They don't necessarily have an incentive to do that as much as we would like, unfortunately. There's so you asked about regulation. Just to note that for a second. You're like, is regulation working? I was asked like, what regulation in general, right? Because like there's been, at least in Washington, and the EU has been much better about this in a lot of ways, but in Washington there's been just such a shockingly small quantity of legible, successful laws in changing any of these outcomes, largely because I think of a lot of funding that's been going, a lot of lobbying that's been happening. I mean, TikTok has started a huge lobbying push in Washington to try to not get itself banned, and it's throwing so much money around in that process right now, which I think is really problematic for a lot of reasons. Not least of which is that they could throw 2024. if we let TikTok, it could probably throw 2024, the election here in the United States. I think it's that powerful of a media tool. But yeah, so things that platforms can do and things that individuals can do. From a platform perspective, I think that basically helpful and healthy frictions are really, really important for improving the way these tools operate. And I track a lot of trust and safety work that has been happening at these companies. We saw a lot of great trust and safety work happen. We saw a lot of kind of heavy-handed, crappy trust and safety work that was also happening. I think content level trust and safety work is actually really bad insofar as that when you ban certain types of content outright, then that actually causes that causes problems. Like it does cause problems because it nurses pretty significant grievances, and there's this kind of like detonation, radius around it, which isn't people that agree with the thing that was deplatformed, but it's the people that look at the thing that was deplatformed and say that could happen to me. That's not okay. We shouldn't be deplatforming this stuff. So instead, I think that the type of frictions that we could instead put in place are things that actually give primacy and improve our relationship with like better content, right? So like reducing the net speed at which content spreads. That's something that you can actually pretty easily do. That Facebook rolled that out with WhatsApp, limited the number of shares that you can actually push out to a large number of people, especially when it comes to certain times of lots of rumors spreading around dangerous and threatening topics like terrorism, pandemics, that kind of thing. That's a time that rumors and gossip can actually cause huge problems, right? So we saw that during the pandemic. I had a pretty extreme experience with that here in New York in the early days of the pandemic, and my broader WhatsApp communities are just trying to help mitigate some of the flood of misinformation. It was actually like really dangerous. There was a bunch of people talking about runs on the bank. There was a bunch of people talking about New York getting closed down and martial law being declared, and people were really scared. And this is not a new problem insofar as like the history of rumors spreading and causing violence is actually very much a deep part of our species history too. The history of most ethnic cleansings in the past comes from incorrect rumors spreading about Jews poisoning wells, these ethnic pogroms that come from that. It's happened just recently in Myanmar as well. So fast spreading disinformation is extremely dangerous, and I think it's important to focus on the actual human outcomes associated with that, and not just hold on to kind of the exclusive free speech absolutism when it comes to sharing stuff like that, because it's ostensibly like the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. It's just like we're crowded online into this giant theater, which is social media right now, and everyone, anyone can shout fire to any number of people actively. So just to answer your question specifically on the platform front, there's a certain type of friction that I think is really helpful, which is the type of friction that switches us from system 1 processing to system 2 processing, right? So taking moments of reflection before you tweet, before you post, before you respond to something. So giving people periods of cool down when they are triggered by a particular piece of content. So I have this rule, this is 10-minute tweets, which is if I'm extremely, like most of the time that I tweet, or the time that I feel the impulse to tweet or post, because Twitter is it's a newly very strange place. It is when I'm angry about something, right? And that's like a natural, like I see something online that's like, I see it being totally ridiculous or totally false, or one of these things that really pisses me off, which is usually when someone's like actively extremely wrong on the internet, I'll be like, ooh, that person, like they're such an idiot. And the first version of the content that comes out of my hands or my mind is almost exclusively like snarky, mean, gross, non-productive, and like angry. It almost exclusively is that, right? So what I've given myself is basically a 10-minute interval before I see a thing to responding to it, and I give that 10 minutes to like cool down, take a few breaths, examine the content, and make sure I'm like actually contributing something positive in this situation and not just adding to the pile on. And that's a big part of it. So there are pretty substantial design incentives you can build into tools to do that. I made some suggestions for some of these tweaks back in 2019. A few of them were adopted at Instagram and elsewhere. But basically ways of identifying the crappy stuff and helping to give the user the choice to cool off before they instant share something that they would later regret.
Do you think that there should be some kind of like government mandate for the companies to do this? Otherwise, why would they?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in general for government mandates for something as like tiny as design incentives like this. I think that's like that gets pretty nitpicky when it comes down to it. yeah, like I think that, yeah. So let me think this through in terms of the actual. So I think that there should be more liability on the platforms for negative outcomes for what they do. And what the kind of outcomes they create in society. I think that's a key point of it, right? So I'm not so for these kind of individualized laws, that design tweaks and stuff that should be implemented from a governmental perspective, but I do think there should be more liability for these companies. These are not neutral platforms. You cannot make that argument. You simply can't. You can pretend that that's the case if you really wave your hands around and really ignore a lot of key issues. But the way we are ordered content and served content on social media, that is not a neutral and biased process. It has arguably never been a neutral and biased process, right? Not since they switched from reverse chronological to algorithmic sorting, right? There's a natural agenda there in every newsfeed to serve us a certain type of content, and it's important to recognize that these aren't just pipes, right? It's not just the platforms allowing for us to share anything anywhere. There are weights and measures being put in place to keep us there for a lot of this content. And now I can speak to WhatsApp and what how that operates too, because I think there's an important little caveat there, which is some of these tools, which are built to be exclusively messaging programs, they do also have weights kind of built into them for a certain type of speed at which content spreads, right? So the number of people you can share with, that makes it a place for extremely fast viral content to spread very quickly and with a lot of danger of harming people. So I think that building more liability. I think Section 230 was, it was great for what it did, but I think we should thank it for its service and amend it and make these platforms more liable for the potential harms that they're creating.
Yeah, we mentioned the potential harms, or not even potential, the very obvious harms, really, of misinformation and disinformation before. And we talked about dark psychology as well. And I know there's a lot of work on how the dark triad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, these things tend to become more prevalent when there's the ability to be anonymous, right? And one of the things I guess I would think about there is, what do you think about legislation or some kind of mandate that was about a digital ID or something that said you really are who you are, right? We know that if you have a social media account, we know that you've been certified through some kind of third-party program, whether it's like a DMV, something with your social security number, something like that. Do you think, one, that would be beneficial to reduce the amount of kind of trolling, antisocial, dark psychology kind of behavior? Mm-hmm. And two, do you think that's even something you would want anyway, because it might run the risk of things like stopping whistleblowers or certain privacy issues? A lot of people push back on this idea a lot when I put it out there, so I know it's not the most exciting for some people. So where do you fall on that as a solution in terms of ethically, pragmatically, all the above?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and basically persistent ID is it's a fascinating topic area. For a very long time, I researched very deeply getting everyone verified online. I had this line for a long time. It's everyone needs verification. We just need to figure out how to get everyone verified, and that would solve a lot of problems. And since then, this was maybe 5 years ago that I was focusing on this. I'm verification would actually really help a lot of our issues that we're facing right now. The key is what we're verifying and how consistent that verification is over time, right? So opening up verification, for instance, to a $7 or $8 per month fee, that's not verifying anything except for the fact that you have a credit card, really.
Right.
Potentially makes it a little bit harder for bots to spread messages, but the rollout at Twitter, I'm sorry, just was extremely botched when it came out. Yes. did not work well, and has I think broken some key trust in the platform. But I mean, and to mention trust here. This is really what it's about. It's not about whether or not someone can have a pseudonym. It's about trust. It's about the inherent ability to trust what you are seeing online is coming from someone that has a reputation that can be tarnished, right? So it's when there's repeat interactions with a person or an entity online. Making sure that they are an actual real person, super important in the context of AI and where we're going from here, right? With the fact that we basically passed the Turing test in all of its text-based permutations online right now. We can there's ostensibly no way we can really easily tell that someone isn't a bot online. That particular kind of foundation of verifying humanness is going to be so much more important, I think, moving forward. There's some of my more kind of extreme friends on this front that say, well, but is it important that it's like, do we really need to make sure that people are humans? I can have a relationship with the bot. It's fine, right? Sure, absolutely, you can have a relationship with the bot, but when you can spin up, infinite bots to present infinite political messages about something, and give someone the perception of consensus around an issue when there is no consensus, for instance, that's not okay, and that shouldn't be okay. So what it comes down to, I think, really is making sure that profiles online are real people, first of all, and second of all, that they have that there are repeat interactions that are available for that basically people can be held accountable for what they say, right? That's, I think, a really critical piece of it, right? Is that a lot of trolling comes from the fact that people aren't accountable to what they say, right? They're just like, whatever, I can shout this person down, I can be angry about this thing, I can say this toxic thing about that thing, and as soon as you attach some level of some level of persistence to the identification of people online, then they are suddenly more accountable for what they say. Mm-hmm. And I think that would go a long way. And I think pseudonymity is super, super important, particularly in the context of people that are working on in places that don't have good civil rights,
Sure.
and freedom of speech. I think pseudonymity is really critically important for the democratic process. But human verification is really critical, and persistence in communication is really important. I think there are technical solutions to this that are actually really meaningful and possible. So yeah.
Speaking of social trust, social capital, and something we kind of skipped past before that I think is obviously central to the book and very important to people. I mean, it's even there in the subtitle of your book. What is the impact on democracy? What are the things that you were alluding to before in terms of how 2024 might be impacted when you were talking about the TikTok interest groups and the way these platforms might hold some sway over people's perception of reality and what we're doing?
Yeah. So we can talk about the influence component of it. And we can also talk about the mis and disinformation piece of it, which I think are distinct issues. They're related, but they're distinct.
Whatever feels most salient to you. Yeah,
sure. So we'll start with influence, because I think it's an important piece to reference. So we were talking about this before about how Section 230 provides this carve out for social media companies to operate as platforms that aren't liable for the content that they share. Social media companies are actually media companies. They operate much more like, if you squint your eyes and look at them, they're basically media companies now. They're not even really pretending to not be media companies, right? They're not competing with the telephone. They are mostly competing with Netflix, right? They're competing with our entertainment, with our free time. That kind of thing. So something like TikTok, which is very much operates much more like a media company, like a television show that is personalized to you. That does have editorial bent, and it does have it does have a say in the types of content that you see, the types of perspectives that you see, the types of ideas that you're exposed to, the types of outrages that you're exposed to or not exposed to, right? So when the Ukraine war launched, TikTok updated its app in Russia and demoted all Ukraine-oriented content, right? So it basically launched a whole new version of the app that just disappeared the issue of Ukraine outside of political propaganda messages. So that's influence. That is absolutely influence, right? And we actually do have laws on the books for influence in media companies that have been a part of our country in the United States for a long time, quite a long time. And one of those conditions and carve-outs was that you can't have a foreign owned media entity above a certain size. So we absolutely have a foreign owned media entity. You can think about it in this context, which I find super creepy. This is a Tristan Harris ism here, which is, if you can imagine during the Cold War, if the USSR owned PBS Kids, right? That is basically what we have right now. But greater, bigger. You know what I mean? In terms of the types, in terms of control over the content that we actually we're being exposed to collectively. So I do think that TikTok is influential enough to definitely throw 2024 election just based on the demotion or promotion of certain content. And I think that's a real fundamental threat to democracy. And you can make these arguments that every media platform historically, from the big three back in the day when you had CBS, ABC and NBC kind of vying to throw elections, they were doing that too. But sure, but they were domestic entities, and also they had some basic foundations of journalistic integrity embedded in the design of their systems. They were monoliths. They were wrong a lot of the time, and they did cause a lot of problems, I think, for our country. But there was at least a fundamental disposition and trend towards factual reporting. I think that's a big portion of that. So that's the influence piece. Yeah. I'll bring this to the disinformation piece, which I think is the bigger. It's hard to rank order these problems because they're both huge threats to democracy. But the disinformation one is really critical because we don't know how toxic misinformation is until it bubbles up in something like January 6th, right? If you talk to January 6th protesters, even the people that were there, they will say that it was, it was an FBI plot, right? Even people that were there bashing police officers, some of them will say it was an FBI plot to rally people into violence, right? And that we were just there to kind of to protest nonviolently, right? So misinformation is this really, really big problem. You need to have a baseline of good facts in order to coordinate, right? And coordination problems are one of the core issues we face right now as a democracy. Democracy is basically this giant coordination mechanism amongst a whole bunch of people in one particular place. And if they can't coordinate together because the misinformation is high enough, right? If there's not enough good information, then the system doesn't work. It just simply it breaks. And you default to smaller groups of coordinating entities. So you'll default down to the state level. You'll default down to the city level. And you require a certain baseline of quality information for democracies to operate. What happens because above a certain point, then it's basically when the convicts or that thing back in the day, it's when the asylum breaks down and the crazy people are running the asylum. That's ostensibly what happens because there's huge numbers of people who have tremendous incentive to run the system the way they want to run it, and they might really deeply believe that what they say is true, but it's probably not true, right? And there's a deep incentive structure built in to the way we share information that predisposes a certain if you give enough people enough money and enough of an audience, they'll pretty much say anything to retain that audience, right? To sell their supplements, if we give Alex Jones enough platform, he will run for president and he will get a sizable chunk of the population believing his bullshit. So so there's a piece of that that's very present, which is we require a certain baseline of quality information to coordinate as democracy.
So as we come to our time here, I want to just kind of turn towards the future and where we go from here. What are some of your closing thoughts in terms of the future trajectory that we're moving towards, and maybe what you'd like to see, or maybe some closing thoughts to leave people with in terms of how they can maybe navigate this paradigm better?
I could approach this from a couple different levels. I am actually modestly hopeful about the future, about us solving these problems, about us kind of navigating this dark valley of issues that we're facing. A couple of the things that make me hopeful about that is that every new technology, specifically every new media technology, goes through this period of kind of collective euphoria, followed by a whole bunch of negative, unintended consequences that come as a result of that. And then this trough in which people, there's a bunch of moral panics. There's also a bunch of good research done. And a lot of people figure out that things are broken and they start to fix it. And I think that, the days of technologists and developers having no qualms and no kind of expected responsibility for what they build, I think those days are probably over to some degree, right? It's you need to ask some of these questions about what might go wrong in order to get the scale that's required to have a big impact. And so if we think about these kind of intervals as like a dark valley in which we think everything's good, we think everything's great because we have this new technology, and there's actually a whole bunch of unintended consequences in that trough, and then we kind of figure out what those are, what those problems are, and then we work our way out in this kind of stepping process, and we come out the other end higher than we were before. I think the recognition that these valleys are inevitable to some degree is present, and I think that people are becoming aware that every new technology has these risks associated with it, and the goal shouldn't be to assume and to avoid the valley entirely, because we're not going to be able to, right? But it should be to reduce the depth of that valley and reduce the length of that valley, and how long it affects us, right? So asking those questions early, I'm heartened to see a lot of technologists ask those types of questions now, before they deploy things to the wider world, particularly in the context of AI and where we're going. I think that I'm hopeful that we'll get through these next ones.